Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to continue on with what I was talking about in my last video, which was how to construct a good story. But I'm going to do it in a much more informal way this time. I'm going to talk about manga and anime and how I can see their possible downfall in the near future. What has happened to the North American comic industry could very easily happen to the manga and anime industry. Because I've been watching both of these industries and read from both of these industries for a long time now. And I can see a similar pattern emerging in what is happening within manga and anime as was happening in the late 90s, early 2000s with comics. And when I say I've been dipping into both of these for a long time, I mean a long time. I had an Akira poster on my wall in 1986. But as I said, I'm going to talk about this in terms of the construction of a good story. And I'm going to use a lot of the sort of technical terms of the construction of a good story that I introduced in my last video. I'll try to reintroduce them here so that you know what I'm talking about, but you might want to go back and listen to that last video. I'll put the link in the description if you want to go watch it now, or at the end if you want to go watch it later. But the gist of the argument that I laid out there was the fact that people look for the most efficient way to do things. That's how human society is actually built. You look at things that we do and you try to find a more efficient way to do it. And I would argue, and so has Aristotle over 2,000 years ago, that the most efficient way to tell a story is through logic and reason. Why? Because through logic and reason, these are the most efficient ways to do anything. That, to some extent, is what logic itself is about. It is the bringing to your attention of the standardized rules and systems that apply to language in order for them to convey the meaning of what is being said as clearly as possible. And that's what you're trying to do with your story. You're trying to convey this story as clearly as possible. So in order to do so, if you want to be the most efficient at doing this, you use logic and reason. As I said in my last video, this is one of the ways that you can describe art. You are trying to advance with order and ease in order to accomplish an end. Although, as Eve rightly pointed out in the comments of my last video, when we're talking about art and the ends of art, we're talking about art as it directs operations which pass into exterior matter. So things like building, sawing, painting, creating a story. And again, briefly, what is the end product of a story supposed to do? Well, as Aristotle said, it's supposed to be a representation of reality. And we know this fairly easily because when you look at a story is constructed usually either through a visual medium or through words. And both of those things are signs. That is to say, a representation somehow of the idea that you are trying to get across. So signs themselves are a representation of reality, and your story depends upon signs, which itself is a representation of reality. And you want to make this representation of reality in the most efficient way possible so that your reader can connect with it. And again, as I said in my last video, there are typically 3 points that you focus on when talking about the, for lack of a better word, parts of a story. The main focal points are your form, your plot, and your characters. Now in my last video, I concentrated on the form and how with the form of a story, you need to have a natural sign. There's a difference between a natural sign and an artificial sign. A natural sign is a sign that is connected to the idea that it is trying to express through something natural. So when I say the phrase red hot, that's a natural sign because in nature, things that get hot tend to turn red. But if I say the phrase it's raining cats and dogs, that is a linguistic connection. That is a cultural connection. The only reason that you have tied in your mind the idea of cats and dogs falling from the sky with the idea that it is raining hard is because of your culture and your language. So that's an artificial sign. And the form of your story is an argument. And this argument, which is a rational argument, which is the efficient way of telling a story, it needs to be set upon a natural sign because artificial signs don't make the basis of a rational argument. If you don't have a rational argument, then you're not telling the story in the most efficient way possible, and it becomes a bad story. But today I'm going to concentrate on that distinction, that difference between natural sign and artificial sign within the plot. And some of you may be asking, aren't you supposed to be talking about heroes? Isn't this what your channel is supposed to be about? I would say yes. The reason why I'm doing these videos is because eventually I want to get to the third part, which is characters, and then I'm going to talk about heroes. So I'm going to discuss this difference within the plot of natural and artificial signs according to a couple of manga that I've been following or dipping into, and express to you the necessity of using a natural sign over an artificial sign by showing that this may jeopardize the entire manga and anime industry by driving them into the same problem that we now have with North American comics. Because a lot of people, most people that I talk to, and I've done this even myself, have this hubristic attitude that what has happened in North America is never going to happen to anime and manga. And I would say that it is quite possibly on the cusp right now of actually happening. And I mean this not in the terms that these industries are going to be taken over by these quote-unquote progressive attitudes and these kinds of people. No, simply that they're going to move into bad storytelling. And that is the beginning of the downfall. I would say that was the thing that led these quote-unquote progressive people to take over comics to begin with. Because I've also been covering over the last little bit a lot of what Stan Lee had said about making a good comic. And the more and more I look into what he says, the more and more I see the structure of a traditional story, an almost Aristotelian story within everything that he says. And one of the primary ideas that came out of his storytelling, I don't know if it came directly from him or not, was the idea that every comic is somebody's first comic. And to me, this says that every comic needs to be tied down to a natural sign. That connection that you have to make with your reader has to be through a natural sign. Now, you can have artificial signs in order to give your story some kind of flavor. You know, those other things that I talked about as categories of the predicate, where, when, to have it in a specific place with specific kind of people and all of that. There's no problem with that. But the thing that ties your reader to the story should be a natural sign. That is to say, it should be something that everyone can access, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from. And the way you do this is through a natural sign. You use a sign that is connected to the idea that you're trying to express through something that is natural so that anybody can pick up on it. And therefore, it doesn't matter if you're starting in the middle of a comic. It doesn't matter if this is the first time you've seen this character, or the first time you've seen this comic title, or the first time you picked up a comic itself. None of those things matter, because if you put that natural sign in there, that connection between the reader and the story that is natural, that anybody can access, then there is something there to hook that reader into the story. And my example that I want to use to bring this out within manga is My Hero Academia. Now, I dip in and out of manga all the time. And so I did with My Hero Academia. I did a 10-second comic review of it over in the community section of this YouTube channel, which I do for manga every once in a while. And the thing is, what I said was that I read a story arc in a half, right up to where it currently was. And it had a good idea for a plot, and it had good characters, but the story simply wasn't connecting, and therefore I didn't recommend it. And then I got a whole bunch of people in my comments saying that, well, that's not the way that you read manga. You've got to go back to the start of the manga and read the entire thing. Yes, that's 274 chapters prior, but that's how you understand it. You can't just dip into it. And with all due respect to everyone who made that comment, I've been dipping in and out of manga for a long time. And yes, you certainly can dip in and out of manga. You don't need to go back 274 chapters in order to understand what's going on. One of the comments made was, if you read all 274 chapters, you would appreciate chapter number 274. But that's just circular reasoning. If I read all 274 chapters, the only reason I would have done so to begin with is because I would have appreciated it. And therefore you're saying, if you had appreciated it, you would therefore appreciate it. So again, circular reasoning. But the other comment was that this is the way manga works. You got to go back to the first. That's the only way you can understand it. And again, with respect to everyone who made that comment, that's simply not true. It makes absolutely no sense. Because let's look at the industry of manga very briefly for a second. Everyone tells me, and I've seen this myself, that the reason why manga is so good is because it is a hyper-competitive, hyper-merit-based system. And if you have a hyper-competitive, hyper-merit-based system, you're simply not going to have a story structure where you gotta go back 274 chapters in order to understand what's going on. It doesn't make any sense economically. Because if this is a hyper-competitive system, the guy next to you is going to say, hey, look, I'm going to take the exact same story as you with really the exact same characters, just changed up a little bit, and I'm going to create a manga which is the exact same, but you don't need to read 274 chapters in order to understand what's going on. Therefore, I'm going to steal all of your audience. That's what would happen in a hyper-competitive, hyper-merit-based system. So this idea that you got to go back to the first, it makes zero sense. But with that being said, I can see the reason why some people might think that. And the reason why is because both of these stories depend upon an artificial sign in order to tie you, the reader, to the story itself. And to explain to you what I'm talking about, I'll be very specific. In the current story arc that I was reading, there was a very dark part of the story. This was the main part of the story, and it was connected to things that had happened previously within the manga, which you would already have to know. But in order to give you something to tie you to the story itself, I believe that what was being put in there to tie the reader to the story was the humor at the first of it. And this was a good counterbalance to the darkness of the story that came later. But the thing is, that humor depended upon an artificial sign. It depended upon the artificial sign of knowing the Japanese language. And here's the thing about humor. Here's the thing about comedy. It is notoriously difficult to translate into a different language, into a different time, into a different place. And why? Well, I would say because humor uses this rational storytelling. And a good comedy, or a good joke, brings you to a sudden realization. And this sudden realization makes you laugh. Or it brings you to a sudden realization that you realize is ridiculous. And you realize it's ridiculous because you know rationally this doesn't fit in with reality. And that sudden realization makes you laugh. I would say this is the basis of comedy, but that's a different video. So, in this story, you had all the students coming back into the school, and you had All Might going out to greet them. And he pranced out and said, "I'm making cotton candy." And the joke there was the fact that in Japanese, the phrase, "I'm making cotton candy," sounds very similar to "Welcome back, everyone." And the reason I know this is because it's explained in the margins of the comic. But I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone that if you need to explain a joke, it's no longer funny. And it's no longer funny because there's no sudden realization. And so the point is that for anybody who doesn't speak Japanese, who didn't grow up in Japan, you wouldn't get this joke, because this joke is dependent upon language, and language is an artificial sign. And so the use of this artificial sign, which is the center of the humor, which is meant to tie you into the story, if you're a non-Japanese speaker, it simply doesn't work. The previous storyline was something very similar. In that storyline, I saw that this connection between the reader and the story was to be made between the father and son pair of Endeavor and Todoroki. And the thing is that when you use a family to do this kind of thing, there are natural signs and artificial signs that are connected to family. But within this story itself, it focused on what I would say is artificial signs. That is to say, the Japanese idea of how a father and son should interact with each other. The Japanese idea of how children and parents should interact with each other. These are all cultural things. And as cultural things, they are artificial signs. And therefore, being a person who wasn't brought up in a Japanese family or in Japan, knowing all of these things already, it simply didn't work as something to connect me to the story. I knew very well that this was a father and son pair, but I had to keep reminding myself of it every couple of pages. It was like, why is he doing that? Oh yeah, right. He's his father. Why is he doing that? Oh yeah, right. He's his son. If the family ties was dependent upon a natural sign, I wouldn't have to do that. Now, does this happen with all manga? I would say no. I dip in and out of One Punch Man all the time, and One Punch Man is dependent upon natural signs. The idea of a hero, the idea of boredom and having to overcome something as a human being, the idea that you're going to die because all these monsters are all over the place. One Punch Man has natural signs, and you can dip in and out of it all the time, and it still works. I did a 10-second comic review of the manga for Ajin, and I had the same amount of knowledge for My Hero Academia as I did for Ajin, which is one season of the anime. And yet, there was something very specific within the story that was a natural sign which tied me to the story, which allowed me to get into what they were trying to do. Because you had the protagonist and the antagonist, and for the life of me, I can't remember either of their names, and they were in this battle of wits. And again, I went back and read at least a half a dozen, if not a dozen chapters. It wasn't that exciting, but there was one scene, I think it was 1 or 2 pages, I'll dig them up and put them in the background, where you had these Ajin, these massive amounts of Ajin that were created, and they were zombie-like Jin, and they were roaming through the destroyed city, and they came across this encampment that was made by some of the citizens that are trying to stay alive. Some of them are wounded, some of them are starving, and you have this chubby little policeman trying to guard everybody. And again, it was done within a couple of panels. You saw these zombie-like Ajin moving towards him, and you saw the panic in his eyes. And that's all that I needed. The panic in his eyes is a natural sign. All of those people trying to survive is a natural sign. I don't need anything else. I don't need to know anything about their culture to know exactly what is going on here. And that one scene of these couple of panels tied me enough to the story that I want to continue reading on with this story, even though the main body of the story is not that interesting to me. Another one that I dipped into would be The Promised Neverland, and that is using natural signs. It is using, to some extent, this terror felt by these people as a natural sign. Now, I would say it's a bad manga for other reasons, not because of its use of signs, but because you don't stand on a battlefield having destroyed this almost omnipotent demon who is going to destroy all of humankind and stand there and have a philosophical discussion about what you're going to do next, not noticing the fact that the demon is actually still alive. It's just a bad story. But that's not my point. The point is that I could get into the story. I could understand what was going on with the story because of their use of natural signs, even if I didn't like the story for other reasons. So going back to My Hero Academia, what do these storylines and my reaction that I got for these storylines tell me? Well, it tells me two different things. Number one, they're continuing to use artificial signs in order to tie the reader to the story itself. Now, even with your comics in the 80s and 90s, they began to do this. And it's not something that technically is a bad thing. You can do so. But the thing is that the only way that you can do that, the only way that you can use, say, cultural signs in order to tie your reader automatically to what is going on, is to focus your attention specifically on that culture. And those are the only people that you're trying to sell these books to. This happened in the 80s and the 90s with a lot of titles that came out of North American comics. And this does happen to some extent with some manga. The reason why some people said you have to go back to chapter 1 in order to understand chapter 274 is because they're saying that in order for me to understand everything that's going on, I need it to be brought up to speed on all of these artificial signs so that I could understand what is happening within the story. But if that's the case, then all of these artificial signs are built upon culture. And if all of these artificial signs are built upon culture, what does that mean? It means you, as a non-Japanese speaker, as a non-Japanese person, you're not part of the fandom. You're not part of who they're trying to sell this book to. You are irrelevant to the fandom of this manga. But that's only one possibility of what is going on. The real reason that I would say this is going on is because these people who are writing this story are getting lazy. And it has happened with other manga in the past. People usually bring up Bleach. The same thing happened with Bleach. It became boring. Why? Because the people were getting lazy in writing the story. And why were they getting lazy? Well, they were getting lazy because they had anime. And this anime was a shortcut in order to bring everybody up to speed in order for them to read chapter 200 or 500. And when you have that shortcut in order to bring people up to speed, you start to concentrate more and more on these artificial signs. And concentrating more and more on these artificial signs is the sign of a bad story. And of course, the anime is going to eventually catch up to these bad stories within the manga, and both of them are going to fall. And why? Because again, they're dependent on a different medium in order to draw the people into the story so that they have some connection to it. And they start to ignore the rule that every comic, every chapter is somebody's first comic, is somebody's first chapter. And you need to have that natural sign in there to connect them to it. And again, they ignore it because they just expect the anime to do that for them. But that gives you a bad story. And here's where I see the possible downfall of both anime and manga. It is, funny enough, in their popularity. If you look at a lot of the attempts to take anime and manga and turn them into actual movies with actual people, they have been failing over and over again. You look at stuff like Death Note, or Attack on Titan, or Dragon Ball Z. You could even go as far back as things like The Guyver, or Northstar. These were awful movies. They just didn't work. And all of these movies, they remind me of the attempt of North American comics to try to be brought into movies and to television in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. They were awful, just like these adaptations of these anime and manga were awful. But then you look at something like Ghost in the Shell. That movie, I don't think, was very good. It didn't do justice to the story, but it was very beautiful, and it was a very good attempt at doing so, in so much as it took seriously the idea that they had to take this story and make it beautiful. But again, it failed. But then you look at something like Alita, and Alita caught. People actually liked this movie, based upon this manga, based upon this anime movie. People really liked it. And I can see this movie as being, for anime, what the X-Men movie was for comics. They're starting to get it right, and when they start to get it right, they're going to really figure out the formula in order to make these things into good movies. And when they make these things into good movies, when they bring these into the popular mind of culture, anime and manga are really, really going to be on shaky ground. And the funny thing is that the more popular and ingrained in culture these stories become, the possibility is going to exponentially increase that the original format of these stories, which are anime and manga, are going to take a turn for the worse. Because the exact same thing happened within North American comics and their stories and their production in these bigger mediums. And again, the reason why is because at the bottom layer of the anime and the manga, the people who are producing these stories are going to become lazy. They're going to depend upon these other ins for people to be tied to these characters and these stories, and they're not going to go back to these natural signs every time in order to make a comic, every time in order to write a chapter. And if they don't, they're lazy stories. So if you're someone who lives outside of Japan and you like anime and manga, the catch-22 of what is going on here is that the more popular anime and manga become, the more you bring them into the realm of normal people, the more likely the source material that you love is going to be corrupted. And quite honestly, I can see this happening in the near future. I can see the decline of North American superhero movies. And where do you think that Hollywood is going to move on to in order to have a deep well to draw from these beautiful stories that they're just going to have to rip out of their original source material and slap on the big screen with this formula that actually works? Well, they're going to go to anime and manga. They're not going to go to these other companies in North America, like DC, or these smaller companies in North America. No. They're going to go to this large pond of really beautiful stories, which is anime and manga. That's where they're going to go. Fortunately for me, I read both. I read both North American comics and anime and manga. So there is a silver lining in it for me at the very least. The silver lining is that once they move on to anime and manga, once they begin to destroy that industry by making these stories accessible to everyone in the culture, the only reason they would begin to do that is because North American comic book movies have failed. And if North American comic book movies have failed, the North American comic book industry will no longer have those coattails to ride on. And they will have to go back to writing efficient, good stories once again. Alright, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. I very much want to hear as many comments as possible on this video, because I'm sure there's a lot of things that I simply don't know that I didn't take into consideration. So please, put them in the comments. Tell me why you think I'm right. Tell me why you think I'm wrong. I would love to hear both. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.